Democrat. Now, he tries to present himself otherwise, but I also think that there's sort of a widespread misconception about what these old categories of liberal and conservative. Clinton, yesterday in the Times, was hailed for his economic program as being Roosevelt-like.
Right,
and
right.
I think that it was. I think it's more, quote, liberal than any economic program proposed by either Dukakis or Mondale, and yet they were considered more liberal than Clinton. So what
more
does
liberal
this say?
because it's dedicated to the idea of using government and the investment of public funds to create jobs?
Well, look, I think that Gore, I'm getting confused already about the two. I think that Clinton believes very, very strongly and on a deeply personal level that government can make a difference in people's lives, and I think a good part of his career is about that. The means, however, are quite pragmatic, and he's willing to try all sorts of things. His program, in fact, I think is rooted in a fairly established democratic idea that has been lost in a belief in sort of this keeping the static programs as they were. Clinton presses his point on production and investment and public goods, and he wants to do that as opposed to things that you consume and then you don't have anything left that you can use for productivity. That is what's dedicated in his program. Now, the means may be different than in the past, but one must remember that what Roosevelt said in the New Deal, and Gary talks about this, and it's connected to the idea of generations. It's the idea of newness. And what Roosevelt says was that we must try something.
Right.
This is a pragmatic idea. Experimentation was always at the heart of the New Deal, and Clinton has, I think, that sense. So I think these old categories somehow are left over not only from our older politics, but also from the Cold War that impressed them on this situation.
You want to add to that before I go
Well,
on?
you know, Clinton comes from the state in America that is most anti-government. They hated Reconstruction there, and they put in a constitution that really hamstrings government. They have to have 3/4 of the voters of the legislature pass every tax. The governor had a small term, a short term, a weak veto, and all that kind of thing. And so he has, from the very outset, had to go against that and say there is a use for government.
Right.
We do need taxes, we do need roads, we do need schools. So he's been very good at working in an anti-government climate. Well, now, if you can take that onto a national level, that would be quite extraordinary.
Charles, can I add
yeah,
one
please.
thing about the generational thing? You mentioned Kennedy when we started this, and certainly we've been living with the Kennedy generation until now. And but that was a generation that liked itself. And you look at the baby boom generation that these two men represent, and it is, by and large, a very unsuccessful generation, especially politically. And it'll be interesting to see if it can redeem itself in this
Unsuccessful
ticket.
politically in what way?
Well, Kennedy came in a wave of, young congressmen
Yeah.
who were just back from the war. And I think I would say I was a little surprised looking back 30 years after marching in the streets to see Tom Hayden as a Santa Monica City councilman. I mean, this is not how we expected things to turn out.
And Jane Fonda married
Right, to Ted Turner.
to
Yeah.
Ted Turner. Can Clinton and Gore win this thing?
Anybody can win this thing.
Is it likely, do you think they will, as Charles Black said, emerge from the Democratic Convention as the favorites, as the front runners?
It's so close now that everybody who makes any kind of move will probably move into the front for a while.
Yeah. Sidney?
I think that Clinton is likely to have a good convention. There's very little conflict here. There's probably less conflict here than at any previous convention since Carter's in '76. That was a winning convention for the candidate.
And took place in
And
New
even
York
that
City.
was torn
Right.
a bit because the Edward Kennedy
Yeah.
surrender or yielding was done with a lot of hard feeling. You remember how he steered around to not,
Right.
so he wouldn't
Yeah.
have to shake his hand. If,
No, but
Well, that was 80.
That was 80.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah, that's right. That was 80.
Yeah.
We'll come back and we'll talk about Ross Perot. There has been a lot written about Ross Perot. New York Review of Books, Gary Wills, A Visit with the Ross Perot, The New Republic. Sidney's been writing a number of things, including Springtime for Perot. And Larry wrote The Man from Texarkana in the June 28th edition of the New York Times Sunday magazine. We'll take a look for the rest of this broadcast and talk about Ross Perot, who he is, what are the defining qualities of his life, and how has he conducted his business career and all of his business about him as a kind of investigator, a man who takes no prisoners when you oppose him. All of that as part of a consideration of what he might be like if he was president. Back in a moment. To turn our attention to the third candidate in this presidential race, Ross Perot. All three members of our group tonight have made it their business to study the Texas millionaire from different angles. Lawrence Wright's cover story on Perot for the New York Times Magazine was one of the longest in that publication's history. Gary Wills contributed an extensive analysis of Perot to the New York Review of Books, and Sidney Blumenthal has been writing substantial articles on Perot for the New Republic for several months. Ross Perot made his most recent appeal to the American public this morning with Katie Couric on NBC's Today Show. We start with a segment of that interview and take a look at this, and we'll talk about it.
Well, let's talk about that.
That's the interesting thing to me.
Because, in fact, you talk about negative ratings, and your negative ratings have doubled in the last 2 months.
What would you expect? Everybody writing every Fruit Loop story in the world without regard to facts. What would you expect?
Let me ask you about the latest story you might consider Fruit Loop, but may give other people some serious pause. It came out in the New York Times yesterday, another story about your penchant for investigations. It said that you hired a private detective to investigate a rival computer processing company that beat you out of a lucrative contract. Would you like to respond to that story?
Well, first off, you've completely misstated the story, Katie, in all candor. This is a story that went on forever. Number one, I didn't hire anybody. Number two, the company that I was chairman of apparently had hired some, not the company, but they had a lawsuit with another company. The lawyers hired an investigator. And the facts are, if you read the fine print of the story, there was all kinds of misuse of federal and state money. So the lawsuit had merit. Now, I was not, as the story says this is a company that I'm the chairman of that hired an investigator in a lawsuit through the law firm. I was not involved directly or indirectly. Now, I am the chairman of that company, or I was, and certainly I'm responsible for everything that happens there. Now, you wouldn't hear anybody say that in politics. Say the buck does stop with the guy at the top. But I find it fascinating that anybody would claim that I, Perot, see, there's a difference in life. In my whole life, I've had a tiny number of lawsuits compared to the size and scope of my business. Now, that is a phenomenon when you look at how little litigation has been in my life. So you start with a thread like that, and then you just play it and play it and play it. Here's the fun part, though. American people are interested in getting the country back on the track, getting the economy running, and the barrage of trying to destroy a candidate with anything. See, I made a joke about pretty soon they'll have me meeting with extraterrestrials. And a few days later, they had me on the front page of a tabloid with an extraterrestrial, so I got to be careful who I'm meeting with.
Well, in all fairness, the private detective, Joseph Wells, said he did discuss this with you personally.
But that's not true. Now, let's go
This is a direct quote from Joseph Wells, so I'm
wait
just
just a
telling you
minute.
from the piece.
Wait just a minute. Any ethical private detective would not be talking about it, right? So we start with, who is this man? Why is he talking about it? And can you, a story that's 8 or 10 years old? I'm just fascinated that instead of talking about the problems that face the nation, instead of talking about the problems the American people are concerned about, we're now into gossip again. But here we are. So what else?
So there it is. That was Ross Perot with Katie Couric on the Today Show this morning. I thank NBC News for allowing us to use that tape, and we'll have another excerpt. But I throw it open to you. You've studied this man. You watch him there. What's going on here?
Well, the most typical thing is that he vilifies the person who said anything at all. If you read that story, you knew that the reporter had court records and went to the detective and said, will you comment on the court record? The detective didn't want to talk. But in response to the things that were produced by the reporter, he did. And, of course, instantly, the reaction on the part of Perot is to go for the jugular of that man. Anybody who speaks out against him, he's going to say he's a disreputable person who doesn't live up to his code as an investigator. Typical.
Right. Lawrence?
Well, I think the fundamental problem with Perot is that he doesn't think he's ever wrong. And it's kind of scary. I think the charges about him being a fascist and those sorts of things are unmerited and really unfair. And people are afraid of Perot for the wrong reason. I'm afraid of him only because I don't think he has any self-doubt. And even when he was on the Today Show last time he was on, he said, for instance, that his company never had a policy of not having, of making people shave their beards. Well, he did have that policy. And repeatedly, he said things that are documentedly true.
What does that say to you? That he doesn't think he is wrong, or that he is incapable of recognizing when he is telling a lie?
I think that he thinks of himself as being innocent in every respect.
How can you, I mean, tell me how you reach that conclusion, that he thinks he's innocent when you have, I mean, he seemed to say to Katie at the beginning of that interview, that's not true. And then she says, but the man was on the record as saying he met with you. And then he begins to draw back. I mean,
you know what I think it is? I think that he's a salesman. He'll tell you what he thinks will close the sale. And you know, that works out in big things and small things. For instance, he'll say, I'm going to be there working in Washington with my head under the hood. I'll be down there with the Senate, with the Congress all the time. Then he'll turn around the very next day and he'll say, the air is poison in that beltway. You won't find me in Washington very often. I won't be there. You know,
but I think
he's making a sale.
I think there's something more central here, and I want you guys to help me understand it. And because there are these cases in which, and this is not the only case, in which he seems to say, well, I didn't meet with him, or he delivered the information to me in the case about the detective in Alexandria, that he all of a sudden showed up and asked me to look at these documents. And then later reporters, Sidney, you and others have said it didn't happen that way. He was asked to come, and he went in search of those documents.
Well, there's a pattern here.
All
and
right.
you can see the pattern from this. Now, it's very hard for people who just see this to understand the whole prehistory of Ross Perot, because this is very typical of Ross Perot. I mean, you can call it a denial if you want, or some people can call it lying. And I think we can debate forever about the character of Perot's lying. I would call it lying. Is he living in his own reality? That's possible. Is he just a salesman? That's possible. And in his business, you know, and a lot of businessmen sort of overstate things, and they want to get deals done. And you know, businesses, sometimes you're dealing with rough characters and so on. Well, there's part of that.
And you got to play hardball to win.
Right, but here he's in front of the whole country here on national television. And now the New York Times has this story on its front page, and the New York Times makes theirs. But, you know, I have done a number of stories of Perot's investigations, and I've had a lot of sources. And they have not always been people who have been willing to be named in public. This story in the Times had someone willing to come forward by name. That's a very tough thing. He had documents. It's empirical evidence, but Perot denies it. Then Perot goes through this other thing that he always goes through, which is that the reason other people best him in business or anything else is that it's unfair, and they're crooked, and they've done something corrupt. And the word he always uses, even especially in private, is whitewashes. There are whitewashes going on, you know, whitewashes, and they've rigged it, and they've wired it, and so on. So he does all of that, and then he begins to develop, you can see the strands of a conspiracy theory developing, you know, that somehow this is a conspiracy against him, to even suggest that this might be true. And he did that in the case of all of these stories that you have before you.
Yeah.
And he claimed that this was all orchestrated by the Republican Party, which is a very hard thing.
Yeah.
All right,
Okay, but all right, well, let's lay that to rest. Did you talk to anybody in the Republican Party about Perot?
No, that's
None?
the least likely thing.
Did you?
I had no sources from the Republican Party in any of these stories, but I do want to add that if I had, the criteria would have been whether it was factual or not. So I think whether you talk to a Democrat or Republican, I mean, there are a lot of Democrats and Republicans.
I didn't talk to any Republicans, but I did talk to Perot.
Yeah.
And this is...
And what did he say? That it was a Republican conspiracy to get him, and that reporters were the tool of the Republican
he's got a lot of
research people?
There's a war going on between Perot and the press, and apparently nationally, Perot seems to represent the people, which is sort of the opposite of what we had expected here. But
well, that's his notion, is that every time he is attacked by the press, his polls go up.
Yes, and they seem to. But my own experience with him in this particular matter about whether he's telling the truth or whether it's a character flaw have to do with this business with, he's remarked that he had never, I asked him if he'd ever had any personal contact with homosexuals. And he said no.
That's
No.
extraordinary. Your story.
And he said,
He said he wouldn't know.
He said, then he went on about AIDS a little bit, and but as for direct contact, no, I really wouldn't know. I mean, I don't know how to answer your question. I wouldn't ask them. How do you ask them, or what? So, then
It's pretty good. In what?
then a week ago, one of his aides called me up and said, Larry, where'd you get this never met a homosexual thing? Because I talked to Ross, and he says he didn't say that. And, but it was quoted, and I said, well, I got it from Ross. And he said, do you have a transcript of your interview? And I said, as a matter of fact, I do. Would you mind sending it to me? I said, sure, here it comes. So 5 hours later, get this call, and he says, I'm convinced you've made an innocent mistake. And I said, that's interesting. How do you base that?
This is from Ross Perot.
This is from one of his
the aides,
close
okay.
aides. And he said, what it says is he had little contact with homosexuals. I said, no. When I asked him, did you have any personal experience with gay people? He said, no. And then he went on to say he had really very little direct contact. And he said, well, the truth is he had 2 homosexuals on his staff. And I said, well, why didn't he tell me that? And if that's true, the answer to the question, have you had any direct experience with homosexuals, would be yes, not no. Yeah. And if he was in close daily contact with them, why would he say he had very little contact?
Did you get this fax after the Peter Jennings interview at night?
This story,
Because that's what happened. He went on the Peter Jennings show, and he said, oh, no, there was never any discrimination against homosexuals. In fact, I had a lot of homosexuals working for me.
Yeah.
And of course, that immediately conflicted.
That's a direct contradiction of what he'd said
So
to
they
you.
were trying to straighten out afterwards.
All right, well, then help me. Go ahead, Sidney. He also engages in this rhetoric about homosexuality, so that this is part of the vilification. Anybody who disagrees with Pro, or even who he doesn't understand, is somehow gay. I mean, there's a kind of derogatory way he talks about it. You're a sissy, or you're limp-wristed, or he's called me indirectly not by name, a fruitcake. See, these are all words for homosexual. These are people he doesn't like. So there's that sort of rhetoric that permeates Pro for years.
All right, I've got to go to the break, but does any of this, in your own judgment, should this be a disqualifying characteristic for someone seeking the presidency?
This particular character's problem?
Yeah, sure. Saying to you, I never seen or know any homosexuals, saying to Peter Jennings, I have people on my staff who are homosexuals, saying that to Katie Couric, I never did that, and then saying, when Katie says the man is on record as saying that he met with you personally.
Well, I'll tell you, I would like to see it be such, but self-righteousness has never disqualified anybody from running for office.
I'm saying should it be, not whether it will.
What about lying?
Yeah.
Nor has that had very much effect, Gary, as you've documented many times.
Well, there are lies
but
and there are
that's
lies,
okay.
and there are other things about Perot that are more important than simply contradictions.
All right, we're going to get to that, too. And we'll also talk about the positive things about Ross Perot for you, those of you who are wondering about what about all the things that define him as a very positive personality on the American political landscape, and also for all of you who want to make the point that Ross Perot represents something that's larger than he is, which is a kind of distrust of the way American politics has been conducted for a long time. We'll talk about that as well. Back in a moment. Ross Perot, who is he? What is he about? What kind of character qualities does he have? And what about the absence so far of specificity on the issues? We'll get to all of those points in just a moment. Come to Sydney and just stay with character for a second. I mean, what is the defining case for you with respect to Ross Perot and questions that ought to be asked and ought to be explored and massaged about him?
Well, I'll try and do this one briefly, but I think that the most important case with Perot, I mean, you can go through the cases. Now we have almost an entire file. We have the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund case where he hires Roy Cohn to trash the
lawyer
veterans.
Roy Cohn. Right.
The lawyer Roy Cohn. We have, but the case for me that's the most revealing is the case of Richard Armitage, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense, who was appointed by President Reagan to head up the efforts to resolve the question of POWs and MIAs in Southeast Asia. And Perot, who very much wanted to head that issue up, who wanted to control that, even through the government, and who has believed all along that there have been POWs and MIAs missing in Southeast Asia and has financed forays of soldiers of fortune there and has been involved with all sorts of fringe groups on the issue, set out to persecute Richard Armitage.
In what way?
Armitage, he decided, because Armitage did not share his views, because Armitage could only deal with the evidence that he had, namely the evidence provided by government investigations, by the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the other agencies. Perot was very frustrated at this because it didn't confirm his view of what was going on. He decided that the reason his view wasn't being confirmed was that there was a conspiracy going on, that there was someone evil at the center of it, that this man Armitage was at the center of it, that he was a drug runner in Southeast Asia, and that he was morally unfit, had been having all kinds of affairs. And Perot went and sought out a detective in Arlington, Virginia.
Initiated it himself.
Initiated himself, got a picture of a naked Vietnamese woman that was a friend of Armitage's, and shows this picture around to reporters and even generals in the corridors of the Pentagon, and spreads these rumors that Armitage is at the center of this conspiracy. He then...
Yeah, well, let me just interrupt the story. Did people step forward to say, this is, you're wrong, this is a
Right.
man of
Let me-
reputation
this is
who's
very-
admired in Washington?
Two important things happen. Perot goes to then Vice President Bush, and this is very much at the heart of this campaign. This is not peripheral. It seems a little crazy. It's not peripheral. And he says to Vice President Bush, I would like to see all the files, all the intelligence files on Richard Armitage and this vast conspiracy, because I would like to prove it. And Bush says, fine, here are the files, and you go through them. And he goes through the files, and he doesn't find anything, which angers him. And eventually what happens is that his relationship with Bush sours, and Perot becomes very, very angry with George Bush. Now, there are a number of other people in the administration who don't want to see Perot anymore. They're very angry at him. They think he's a conspiracy monger, trying to discredit somebody who they think is a pretty good man.
By this time, he's a principal aide to an Assistant Secretary of Defense under Caspar Weinberger.
That's
Armitage
correct.
is.
Right. Among the people who feel this way about Perot, who have not stepped forward yet publicly, but who I know feel this way from talking to a lot of people in the Pentagon, are Colin Powell, Frank Carlucci, Caspar Weinberger, certainly Bush, Ronald Reagan. A whole list of people who have not registered their real feelings about Perot yet. They haven't weighed in. They haven't told us about their relationships with Perot. Now, something else happens. This is the second part. Armitage is nominated to be the Secretary of the Army by George Bush, now President. Perot conducts a crusade against Armitage, running up and down the Pentagon corridors with this picture of this naked Vietnamese woman, and saying he's in the conspiracy, and using all of his resources against Armitage, sending out these, contacting this investigator.
Talking to senators?
Talking to senators, and so on. Now, what happens? Obviously, if you're going to be nominated for an office, the FBI checks you out. This is what happens to everyone. The head of investigations in Washington of the FBI, a guy named Buck Revell, who I spoke with, goes to Perot. He says, all right, Mr. Perot, I would like to hear all your allegations against Richard Armitage because it's essential that the FBI check them out. We're going to check them out. And Perot tells him all the allegations. The FBI checks out every single one. They come back to Perot and they say, Revell says to Perot, as he has told me, we have checked these all out. The FBI has done it, and we cannot substantiate any of them. And Perot said to him, according to Revell, that's fine. And then Perot goes on, carrying on his crusade of persecution against Armitage, and carrying on his crusade against the person he believes is principally involved in the cover-up of the conspiracy, George Bush.
And what is Ross Perot saying about this story written by you and others today? Is he denying it? Is he saying it wasn't me? Is he saying it was simply...
He denies all sorts of aspects of this story, detail by detail.
Yeah, he appeared earlier on the Today Show, and Katie Couric had the story of his producing the photograph one time. And she said, did you keep that photograph? He had said, I took the whole file and gave it to Bush. And he said, no. And then he stopped and realized that he had, and he said, I kept the file. And the photograph was in it. But, you know, this instant denial of something that was obviously
And in fact,
the
he had
case
the photograph in his safe, and he would show it to reporters
just
who would
shows
come.
this readiness to go out and
Anything
confront
you wanna add to
reality.
this? And is this, in your judgment, a defining issue with respect to Ross Perot and his seeking the presidency?
No, I mean, all these things have been said, and people don't care.
Yeah, and the ratings continue to go. In fact,
I
not
don't
only
think it
that,
has anything to do with the
after
campaign.
months of it, his ratings are he's still leading
He's
in a
going
recent
up.
poll.
He's had nothing but a blizzard.
So therefore, why? What does that mean? That the American public listens to all this and they say, listen, our hunger for something new and fresh and different and a can-do kind of guy causes us to overlook whatever that is that you reporters are pointing
Not
out.
only that, I think that we've had a number of cases where somebody feeds on a mood that the government is all wrong, on a wrong track. For instance, Joe McCarthy said that the government was riddled with communists, both parties, that the press was trying to destroy him for telling that. Now, there was a willingness for years, for several years, for people to think that that was true, even though McCarthy's allegations were never backed up. You know, he had the most flimsy responses when anybody asked him anything, and yet the certitude that there was something wrong in government, that there were communists there somewhere, that the press was just out to make a martyr of this fellow, was so strong that he rode a high in the polls much longer than Perot did.
It's clear, Sidney, that the campaign is concerned about all this. I mean, I read all the stories, they feel like it's stalled, and yet at the same time the polls are high. I mean, what's going on in your judgment with respect to the Perot campaign and how they see this?
Well, what I hear out of Dallas is that there's tremendous confusion. They don't really have a strategy. Some people who've recently been hired have sort of talked about quitting already.
You mean, does this
Yeah.
include Rollins and Jordan?
I would say that there are heavy rumors about Jordan. There are also, there's a lot of talk seeping out, I've heard from sources, about sort of business contracts promised to people after the campaign of millions of dollars for 5 years that won't show up on the FEC records now. I mean, there's a lot of, and there's a lot of conflict between the grassroots organizers who, by their very character, are kind of naive, believing people, right? You know, and here come these professionals, and they're trying to impose some sort of top-down organization. They're very unhappy about it. So I think Perot doesn't really have a campaign that's moving forward, except based on this kind of overall discontent now.
Well, he's not running against Lincoln and Roosevelt. He's running against a failing president and the governor of Arkansas, and that keeps him up to start with. And plus, I think people have been voting in presidential races for 12 years for cutting government back radically, and it's grown radically. And the frustration level's very high, and he's just an expression of it.
Okay.
I think the meanness, the press has made him seem like a mean junkyard dog, and people are saying, yeah.
Well, is the press wrong about saying he's a mean junkyard dog?
They're
You
wrong
included.
in that it's not the total story on him. This is a man that's given away nearly $200 million in charities, and practically nobody's written about it.
Right.
It's a man that's got a whole country full of dedicated POWs and military people he's assisted, and he's been very generous about his assistance to people in need. And people know that, and they're resentful that the press isn't writing about that side of his character. And I think that they see Perot as someone who's trying to rise above the meanness of the political process that we have in this country right now. And they see all the attacks on him as being the process attacking him, and that he doesn't deserve it.
All right, let me take a break. We'll be right back, and we'll talk about how these three distinguished journalists look at Ross Perot in a broader perspective, and why they think, and what it is about him that they think has contributed to his success and might define him as president. Back in a moment. 23,000 words for the New York Times Magazine. This is 16,000, but a lot more than normally you see in a profile that's on the front page here. Ross Perot, president, that was, in high school?
That's his junior college picture.
Yeah.
He was president of his class. And
Yeah. What do you think, if we want to understand this man and understand the forces that shaped him, there are those who say you need go no further than Texarkana. You don't need to go to the Naval Academy. You don't need to go to EDS. You can find everything you need to know about Ross Perot from Texarkana. Tell me what you think we ought to understand about the forces that shaped him and may still be influential.
Well, you know, you can see some of this disparity that we were talking about earlier between this sort of idealized image of himself as being this innocent, virtuous man, and, you know, the other sides that we've seen in his character in Texarkana. He always depicts it as being Norman Rockwell's hometown, and really in Texas it's always had a different reputation. It's not to demean the good people of Texarkana, because I've had a number of friends from there, but it's a...
You may want to go there again.
Indeed. But it's had the reputation of being a place where desperados, it's sort of the Badlands, you know, jurisdictions all came together there. The courthouse, which is right in the middle of State Line Avenue, used to have the Arkansas courthouse on one side of the post office building, the Texas courthouse on the other, and they had bars in the hallway because fugitives would jump across the hall and they'd be out of...
And so how did this shape Ross Perot?
Well,
this
I think
place?
that he grew up in a town that he idealized, and yet it had prostitution up until very recently, quite openly. There were gun runners. White slavery was a common term in the town. It was a kind of nefarious place. It had a dirty side, and he knew it. He realized, you know, he threw papers, he says, to the whorehouses and so on. And
On his bicycle or something?
well, the horse versus bicycle controversy is probably one of the most meaningful things to Ross Perot, and it's very telling because in Todd Mason's unauthorized biography, he wrote that some of his Perot's boyhood friends said that that was not really true. He rode a bike like everybody else. And Perot, there were 5, I think, items in that book he contested, but that one was the heart and soul of his argument with that book. And he sent letters of apology made out to himself, to the publisher and the author. Dear Mr. Perot, and he sent a map, an oversized map of Texarkana with his routes traced. And just for the historical record, I did find someone who rode horseback with him on his paperback.
Well, you've made a study, Gary, of the notion of what influences have shaped people, whether it's Abraham Lincoln or, in fact, Richard Nixon or John F. Kennedy and others. Tell me what you found with respect to Ross Perot.
Well, you know, he has always loved very disciplined organizations. His scoutmaster said to me that he thought, small as he was and that kind of thing, he was a super achiever, but he loved the Scouts because you had to perform. There was a ladder that you climbed, and he climbed it as fast as he could, and he was very good at that. He liked the Naval Academy. He didn't like peacetime Navy because it was not that way. He liked IBM for a while. Then he set up his own company in which he was the boss, and he liked not only discipline and the uniform and all that kind of thing, but secrecy. From the beginning, he was secret even in ways that were unnecessary. He didn't want any of his employees knowing what the other employees made. And it's true that he's very generous, and he impresses people by that. But he wants it to be personal largesse. He didn't have an expectable bonus program. The gifts all had to come spontaneously from him. You didn't work with the idea that you earned something by putting in a certain number of hours. It came as a surprise. He would go around and give gifts to the wives. He was always the person who was pulling the strings. And, you know, his first setting up of a business, he was working for Blue Cross in the morning and then using his office to set up this company that would sell, that would form contracts with Blue Cross. You know, and this went on for 6 years, and he was drawing a very substantial salary for the time. And so I asked him, didn't you think that was conflict of interest? He said, oh, no, 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 they asked me to help them out. Blue Cross did. You know, everything he's done...
Wait, this was when he was working for IBM.
No,
No.
he had left IBM, and he went to work for Texas Blue Shield.
Right.
And he worked in the morning, giving them advice on their computer operation. Then he would come back to them in the afternoon and sell them computers to fill out the advice he had given them as one of their employees in the morning.
Yeah.
It was the most extraordinary thing. And then, when Medicare and Medicaid come along, he gets Blue Shield to sign these contracts with him. They were secret contracts. There was no paper negotiating trail. There was no bid for competition. And so when the Social Security Agency, which was in charge of this, came back and said, well, show us what procedures you followed, there were none. And then he said, well, I won't show you my profit structure, even though he's dealing with the government. I'm only a subcontractor. Blue Shield is the contractor. And yet every other company in the same position had shown those. All the way through his life, he's wanted to have this control over his own little fiefdom. Even when he went to GM, he demanded that he have the ability to have secret bonuses, to keep certain aspects of the books secret from the parent company. He's selling his company entirely to GM and saying, but you can't look at the books. You know, it's extraordinary.
Sidney, of all the things, probably no one, I suspect that Ross Perot believes that no one has been tougher on him than you have. I mean, when you write a piece that's called Springtime for Perot, we know what the image is there, don't we? What good can you say about this man? What is it that is defining that might be positive?
About Perot?
Yes. No, about Hitler. Come on.
What positive?
Is there nothing to be...
I think he's been quite philanthropic in the Dallas area, but as Gary points out, this is all quite personal. You know, he has not really established an institutional presence that's removed from him and managed apart from him like other people who've had great fortunes, like, see, Andrew Carnegie would establish the Carnegie Institution for Peace or something like that. There's nothing like that Perot has created.
Well, did those people do that at the end of their life or before they, you know, through their will, or did they do that while they were living? And
a lot of them did it while they were living, and some of them did it at the end. And obviously the robber barons were not all great philanthropists. Yeah. And they didn't go into this to be altruistic, and the same is true of Perot. But I do want to say something else, which is that Perot has succeeded at one thing so much that his failures at other things have been sort of muffled. Yeah. He's insulated himself. And so you see him as this enormous success, and that is his greatest selling point. That
the legend of Ross Perot.
That he's a success. I mean, I think that's why people are attracted to him ultimately. They believe that they will get this successful man to make things successful.
People want to believe in their president's karma.
And we like a legend, too, don't we? We're looking for heroes, in a sense, in America. You also point out in another piece here that the rescue in Iran was not all it was cracked up to be.
There was no real rescue.
Right. There happened to be a demonstration. They took advantage of it, right?
I think that this is all mythology.
Yeah. Let me go. You think that he is here to stay, that he will be a factor in this race, and that this is not soon to go away, as some think, and be less of a factor by the middle of October?
Well, that's what I think. Whether Perot goes away, what brought Perot to the surface is not going to go away. I think he is just, he's just a creature that happened to rise up in this storm, and his great talent was defining it.
Yeah.
And that's why people turn to him.
Can he win?
Yes, I think he can win.
You think he will win?
I don't think he'll win, but I think he can
Sidney,
certainly win.
Do you think he'll be a factor till the end?
He'll be a factor till the end. Where he ends up in terms of the percentage he takes will have a great impact on who the ultimate winner is. I think that if he goes down, say, below 20%, he is going to severely damage George Bush, because I would say by a margin of 2 to 1, he'll be taking Republicans right out of Bush's column.
What if he stays up around 30%?
Well, I think he might hurt Clinton some.
Yeah.
And I don't see him staying up that high.
Gary Wills.
I think he'll fade as McCarthy, Father Coughlin, Charles Lindbergh, other people who had this kind of emotional anti-government impact. How fast he will fade is another thing, because it took months, and in some cases years, for them to do
Whether
it.
it's November or December.
Yeah, exactly.
I thank you all. We, once more, invite Ross Perot to join us on this program. We've invited him before. We'll invite him again, and we hope that we will have him here, and perhaps even next week. What an interesting time to have him. I thank you for joining us tonight. Tomorrow we spend a full hour with one of America's most admired and controversial novelists, the Pulitzer